Welcome back to another episode of Swadeshi, Videshi by yours truly, Sudhanshu. And today, this week, we're going to be doing things a bit differently. We're joined by Professor Dr Maha Aziz, who is a faculty member at NYU and has recently just came out with her first book called The Future World Order, A Global Legitimacy Crisis Cured by Tech. Professor Aziz, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Sudhi.
So I'm going to give our listeners a bit of a brief bio. You went to Brown.
Yes.
Then you did your degree at SIPA and then LSE.
I did my PhD at the LSE.
At the LSE.
Exactly.
And then this is your first book, but you do have something beforehand that I've read.
That's right. My first publication is a comic book, which I drew. It's called The Global Kid. It's won 3 awards. It's in fact up for its 4th award at the Educators Challenge. There will be an event at the LSE next month. And it's a comic book that teaches tweens and teens about global challenges. I do highlight a couple of case studies, country case studies, Myanmar, Saudi Arabia, countries where I felt there were notable shifts happening. And yes, it's still available, theglobalkid.org, if anyone is interested.
Fantastic. So in a way, the comic was an attempt to dispense information and kind of complicated information to a much younger generation, younger crowd, and it'd be digestible
Exactly. I'm a professor at NYU, as you know, and I work with graduate students. My specialty is global risk, political risk, effectively what might go wrong. And I consult with governments and corporates on this topic. But I feel that it's really important for the younger generation to be more aware of the challenges that they are going to have to deal with. And I'm encouraged to see that around the world you are seeing youth-led movements that are being noticed. The most recent example is the one that's occurring across Europe. A Swedish teen protested for many months outside her parliament, I believe, in Sweden, so that her government would recognize the significance of climate change. And that has led to a movement across the EU. We'll see if it leads to some sustainable policy change, but I think it's encouraging to see that more youth are becoming more activist. In fact, in my book, my current book, Future World Order, I do encourage the reader to see how they can leverage tech as a tool to become more activist, to tackle some of these key challenges.
So we'll get into that. So this podcast is primarily geared towards an Indian diaspora audience, and then the second layer could be a South Asian audience. But that being said, I think it's important to see trends, because I don't think that South Asia in general is an anomaly. I think that there are trends, what you were saying about Europe, in America, et cetera, where you can compare and contrast. And I think it's important for this podcast because we're gearing towards diaspora members, right? So our listeners are from the UK, they're from the States, they're from different countries but something draws them back towards what's happening back home. So I think what's super important and interesting is, what do you mean by a global legitimacy crisis? Because that sounds really complicated.
Yes.
If you could kind of just break that down, and we'll see.
Of course. So basically, in my research and my consulting work and my teaching in the last couple of years, since 2012, I started to notice that there was a growing anti-government strain building in most countries. And this
is pre-Trump era.
This is pre-Trump. There's a tendency for all of us these days to be overly reactionary to Trump. And across the pond in London, where I'm also a fellow at the LSE, for us to just focus on Brexit and blame everything on these 2 factors. But in fact, a lot of the trends we see today around the world have been building since as early as 2008, 2009. I think it's important for youth, including South Asian youth around the world, to be aware of the fact that many of the challenges they may face in the Indian subcontinent are actually happening all over the world. In the book, I talk about 4 key questions that we're faced with, or challenges that we are faced with. Number one, the big question is, what is the world order? We know that the US President Trump has been very clear that he does not want to be the leader of the world. He does not want to be the US to be the hegemonic power. So we no longer have a post-Cold War era led by the US, which promotes democracy and human rights. That is a major shift that's happening right in front of our eyes, and the youth, including South Asian youth, will have to come to terms with what role does South Asia play in this new world order. There is a tendency nowadays to default to China, that okay, the US is stepping aside on many major key issues, but China is taking a larger role. But there are other theorists who argue that the future is Asian. And I'm going to plug my friend and unofficial mentor, Parag Khanna's book, where he talks about, yes, of course, we're seeing the rise of China, but within Asia, there are many other countries that are trying to take a larger role. And I think we need to be aware of the fact that every individual, whether you're a professor, whether you're a student, needs to be aware of this major shift that's happening and reflect on where does your country fit in this new world order. There are also other theorists who argue the future is African. The greatest number of youth by 2030 will be in Africa, apparently, according to some studies. So this is a major question. What is the structure of the new world order? Where are we headed? That's the first question every individual, including South Asian youth, should be concerned about. Number two, since 2008, perhaps, we've seen that there's been this challenge to not just democracy, but also dictatorship. There's a tendency now for citizens armed with tech to question the legitimacy of their ruling elites, of their governments. And the question is, what's next? Have we seen the end of democracy? And is there another phase in our political development? How does this relate to India? How does this relate to Pakistan? I think South Asian youth need to be concerned about what their political system should be. How can we reduce that gap, that growing gap, legitimacy gap between citizen and government? In my book, I consider how tech could be part of the equation, part of the solution, part of the cure. So again, everyone, including South Asian youth, need to reflect on this question. If democracy is no longer the best system, what is? Thirdly, I think it's safe to say for the last 15 years, there's been a debate about globalization, that it is increasing inequality. Many people feel left behind, and I think that has continued. But now we're seeing the rise of populist governments, economic nationalists, policymakers who feel that globalization may not be the best option for us. And then you throw in the cloud of automation, the looming cloud of automation-related unemployment. Many of us are going to lose our jobs to robots. There are enough studies that say it, and not enough policymakers who are really legitimately prepared for this shift that's happening and that will happen. What will happen to youth who are entering the job market in the next 10 years? But governments have not necessarily prepared us for these new jobs that will be coming up in the tech sector. So that is another key question. Are we prepared for the challenges to globalization, but also are we prepared for automation-related unemployment? How does that relate to South Asia? I believe India is trying to become, or is a major tech player, but is the government, our future governments, going to be prepared for what that means for the job market, especially as it relates to youth?
Right, you see a lot of rhetoric towards youth and skill-based job or training, and because preparing them for that future.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is the third key question that every region is going to have to tackle, including South Asia. And fourth, the other major question that we need to consider, and I think frankly this is the most serious one. We are faced with a global identity crisis. The norms that the US-led world order promoted of democracy, of human rights, of liberal values is no longer the case. Okay, I don't yet see a government or any country that is fulfilling that role of promoting liberal values that could counter the growing extremism we see in the world today. And there's a trend towards xenophobia. There's a trend towards extremism, not just Islamist extremism, but of course, we've seen in New Zealand most recently far-right extremism. Right. We've seen in Southern Asia, in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, the rise of Buddhist extremism. Of course, in other parts of South Asia, including India, Hindu extremism is a concern. Where is the counter-narrative to the rising xenophobia, the rising extremism? This is a key question. What are our global values? What are our values within our countries, but what values are important to us as an international community? Again, I feel we're not hearing the rhetoric from policymakers, except maybe from Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. After the attack, she in her country, she rightly said, let's launch a global campaign against hate, against extremism. I think that was a very powerful statement she made. Are other countries going to jump on her bandwagon and help promote this campaign, global campaign against xenophobia and so forth? I don't know if her country or her leadership has the legitimacy at this stage. New Zealand is still a growing power in the world. And as I said, every country is now repositioning itself in this new world order to see where they fit in. So we have a lot of key problems that it's as though the status quo that we became so comfortable with is being challenged. And that effectively is the global legitimacy crisis, where the norms that we felt would never really go away. We didn't necessarily think that the US-led world order would disappear. Yeah. We didn't necessarily think we would be debating the decline of democracy in the West, and even questioning democracy as a system globally. Right. We didn't necessarily think globalization would be challenged by populist governments and by robots. And I don't think we really saw this coming, this identity crisis, where we should be wondering, especially youth, what are our global values? This is a scary time, and I don't mean to alarm everybody. And if you happen to come across my book, Future World Order, you'll see that I have been largely negative about what's coming. We don't have a consensus. We will not have a consensus on these 4 key areas.
We'll get into what's coming in. So I'm really interested. Is the 4 questions, I think themes that you brought up just now, and I'm in midst of reading it. I have not read it. I think it's interesting because as what I would say an area studies podcast, we focus very specifically on India. But it's interesting because all of the 4 issues that you've spoken about, these themes, I've spoken with other people on this podcast before that derive or deal with those 4 thematic issues within India. And obviously they're affecting people. So at a very localized level, whether it's at a local tier governance or the upper echelons, whether it's our actual government right now, we see that taking place. And it's interesting to see this at a global scale rather than just in India, because we tend to, as an Indian diaspora or just Indians in general, we get fed up of, let's say, the Indian system. Oh, this is it. And then we try to compare it to, let's say, in America. And we don't necessarily see how terrible right now what's happening in America. But those issues, you make it seem like, are on a global scale rather than just a very India or South Asia centric.
Yes.
These faults are there.
Definitely. I think most countries are suffering from an identity crisis, a legitimacy crisis. And if we take a step back...
When you say countries, do you mean people or do you mean like the nation state?
Well, both. I think governments are struggling with a challenge from their own people. I think we've seen that in the last few years, where because of tech, we have this chronic crisis of political legitimacy in most parts of the world, where citizens armed with tech, even in the era of fake news, are more informed. They're more informed about what government is doing. This allows them to be more empowered and activists, that they can leverage tech to react to government policy in a much quicker way than they could 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So if you look around the world in the last few years and you document all these movements, it's remarkable. And I'm not saying that I'm an anarchist. I'm not saying we should forget about government, but governments, including in South Asia, need to be more adept at responding to people's concerns, which are much more aggressive now because of tech. On the other hand, you could say tech can be the tool that can reduce that gap. I mean, there are countries around in Europe, for instance, Estonia, that have managed to leverage tech to make certain services more accessible for the average person. So they feel their government is more responsive to them. And I think there is an effort to do that. We're at that starting point where more governments are becoming aware that tech can help us reach our people. And I believe, in India, I had read that blockchain is actually being leveraged in some, I forget exactly where.
There's a Chandrababu Naidu who's a state CM, and he's rebuilding his capital of Telangana, and he's using blockchain as
to reduce corruption,
systematic channeling of different departments, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly, and I think that's positive. If that's this is a step forward.
But that's an anomaly. That is one separate example that you won't see. Well, one thing that I'm thinking about right now and focusing on tech, especially in India, tech to an average listener has now come to social media, digitization, et cetera, which are important, but that you see a pushback too for tech.
Yes.
Because of this, crisis, what you're saying, when people, it's young people that are ranting on Facebook, Twitter, social media, writing, and they're participating because of tech, but they're also the ones going to jail because of, there have been so many instances where young people have ranted about a politician or a public leader, and they've been booked in cases.
Because of what they've posted on social media.
Because of what they've posted, because they criticized.
Exactly.
So where's that middle line? I mean, how do you?
It's a struggle. Yeah. I'm not saying I've offered tech as a possible cure, but obviously it's not perfect. We all know that Facebook is facing a huge backlash. Correct. There's concern about how Facebook has been a source of election meddling, right? Russia allegedly has interfered. We know that extremists are using Facebook, WhatsApp to spread their message of hate. I believe there's been some coverage about WhatsApp being used in India to promote certain hateful rhetoric. There are definitely examples in Sri Lanka and Myanmar where extremist rhetoric against Muslims has been used. Facebook has been used to leverage, to spread this message of hate. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think at a certain point there will be more regulation. Although I don't know when that will come. I think it's very difficult to predict. And in every conference I've attended in the last 5 years, there's been some representative from tech, especially from Facebook, where they've told us they've been very apologetic about what has happened, how their technology has been used, and they said they will try harder. It's years later and we're still seeing it. We just saw, again, New Zealand, it was live streamed on Facebook. So I'm not sure.
Taking it down was so difficult.
Exactly. Well. So there's clearly a lot of improvement that needs to happen. I don't know. I'm not a techie. I don't have the speciality, the background to really, to predict exactly when that will happen. But I feel it's worth highlighting the ideas of Kai-Fu Lee, who's written a book called Issues and the Legitimacy Crisis. Of course, it's happening at the government level where citizens are challenging governments and governments are struggling with how do we respond to our people.
With citizens.
Yeah, but then you also have the identity crisis within society, right? Where I would imagine youth in India are also wondering what are our values, what does it mean to be Indian in light of the growing extremism. And I feel that's happening in most parts of the world. One just has to read the news and it's all right in front of us.
No, I mean, I think that's a perfect segue because this season of Swadeshi Videshi, what we're starting off, is going to focus on, as you know, the world's largest, quote-unquote, biggest democracy festival is going on in India. Everyone loves to, throw those words out and generalize. So I think it's interesting because from an Indian perspective, we have a lot in stake. And what you say and these themes that you're coming out of, there is a legitimacy crisis in India within its government. There's a legitimacy crisis within society as well. You know, we are at what has been the most fractionalized society because there is a very stringent left wing and there's a very proactive right wing as well at the same time. And both are colliding and it's interesting to see what's coming out.
Yeah.
And I bring this out because I think what you're touching upon at a global level, you're seeing, especially in that identity issue. And then you see this emergences of tech, not just in campaigning, but how systematically things are moving ahead. I mean, if you look at, you know, campaigns from 2014 to now, there have been vast distinctions, a little bit of more mellow campaigning, but the usage of tech, and you don't see it out in the streets, you see it within your phone screens and things of that nature, which is drastically different because at first you used to, you know, the reason they used to call or do call India the festival of democracy, etc., because it was so vibrant. You know, every day, and I'm assuming in other South Asian countries it's the same, but you out in the streets there would be a rally, a motorcade, this, that, whatever by every local. And now you see it on the palm of your hands taking place, and no one knows what's going on in there. It's happening in a way. So I think, and the reason I want to go back to this, I think it's interesting, is because listeners need to understand that this isn't just India's case. Yeah. It's
this is a global
everywhere.
debate.
Yeah.
This is a global issue, and I think you may be familiar. I don't mean to keep plugging theorists, but you should be aware, listeners, of Francis Fukuyama. Post-Cold War declared, he's a political theorist, I believe at Stanford nowadays, and he declared that we had reached the end of our political development, that this was it. Democracy was the best system. This was early 1990s, I believe, when he wrote it. And now he has come out and said, I really fear for the future of democracy, because the challenge we're seeing in the Western world and outside, we really need to sit and reflect on what do we mean by democracy now, and is it really delivering the public goods that we expect? This is unprecedented, you know, post Cold War to be having this debate, and I think it's a serious question we have to reflect on. And in my discussions with students, and I generally have students from all over the world at NYU, and you hear their perspective based on their life experience in different countries, and they all seem to have the same question as to what could come next, what could be the next phase or stage of our political development if democracy is not the final point as we had earlier imagined. So I really feel that youth globally and in South Asia are really in the driving seat. It's up to you to reflect on what it is that you want, what do you expect of your government, whether you label it democracy or not. What is it that you expect of your leaders? Because I think it's probably a struggle for the older generation who came up with a lot of these theories and expected that they would always be relevant to really contribute to the debate in a way that's significant. It's up to people like you, Sudhi, and your listeners to really take the time to reflect on what it is that you want, whether that translates into a youth-led movement or a decision to join politics at a young age. I mean, that's up to you. But I really feel my responsibility as a social scientist who's been focused on risk, you know, the threats to our stability, for so many years. My job is simply to enlighten and educate as many people as possible about the fact that these problems have been building for many years, and it's not a question of a particular region or a particular country. We are all faced with the same problems, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? There need to be new ideas. I've subtly suggested that creative application of certain tech can be one way. It's not the only way, you know, and your generation, I'm a very old millennial or a very young Generation Xer, depending on, I don't know, the cutoff.
Right.
But I feel your generation is more creative, is more entrepreneurial. I think you are in a better position to come up with ways that can really tackle these issues. I think the older generation, the 70-year-old politicians, or the 55-year-old politicians that are still figuring out social media, it's going to be a struggle for them. So get on top of it now.
And to conclude, my last two questions, or last question in one statement. First of all is, again, I'm going to plug in the 2019 general elections in India. Incredibly important, not just, as a daily Indian citizen, to vote, to participate, to choose a government. What would you say, as obviously someone who's written a book about a global legitimacy crisis, how important and essential is it for especially people like me and the vast majority of young people within India to carefully choose a government? You think that their decision will either propagate or help console this global legitimacy crisis that's occurring?
Exactly. No, that's a great question. Obviously, like you, I would say vote. That's important. But it doesn't just end with your vote. I think we've seen in many parts of the world, including here in the US, even after people voted, they've still come out onto the streets and protested about issues that were important to them. So don't feel that once your vote is in, that's the end of your job. I think this is clearly an era of more citizen engagement, and that's again partly facilitated by social media. So definitely be aggressive in being informed, be aggressive in taking action when you don't agree with what policies are in place, because I think there are quite a few examples in the last few years around the world where people-led movements have not just brought down certain dictators, but also shaped policy in countries which have governments that are democratically elected. There is potential for you, even if you're not in politics, you're not a politician or a member of parliament, that you can help shape policy simply through people pressure.
I'm going to assume that's a yes, by the way.
Yes. Yeah. So I would say just keep at it. Your generation, we have the most at stake. Yes, there's a lot at stake, and I apologize on behalf of the older generations that we helped create these problems, and frankly, your generation, the post-millennials and younger, will have to be more aggressive in tackling these issues, because you can talk to the experts, you can talk to the academics, you can talk to former, people currently in government who are much older than you, but they're also scratching their heads. I've talked to people who are dealing or trying to tackle the Brexit issue across the pond in London. I've talked to people who are formally of government in different parts of the world, and everyone seems to be scratching their heads. So this is an opportunity for your generation to really shape the way shape our future. So don't blow it.
Well, that's a lot of pressure. Thank you so much, Professor Aziz, for coming on to the show. And by the way, you didn't hear about the solutions that Professor Aziz recommends. For that, you'll have to buy the book, The Future World Order, A Global Legitimacy Crisis, Cured by Tech, and it's available on Amazon. And you can also go to www.futureworldorder.org and you can buy it there. Thanks again, Professor Aziz.
Thank you. And by the way, Sudhi is my favorite student.
Yes.
Thanks, guys.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation that we had today. We're bound to make mistakes, but we'll only learn and get better from here. Now, if you want to take part in Swadeshi Videshi, any questions, suggestions, or just want to tell me how much you love Swadeshi Videshi, you can contact me on Twitter @Sudhanshu.